Good afternoon to all our Estonian listeners and good morning to our Canadian guest. My name is Taavi. I'm the head of the Foresight Center at the Estonian Parliament. And today we are discussing the upcoming round of the digital economy, what it might entail and how to prepare. We've seen already digital disruption in some service sectors, for example, accommodation or ride sharing, music industry, media, etc., where digital platforms or streaming services have redesigned the whole logic of value chain. Probably in 20 to 20 years, we start to look at these changes as the very first steps that will be followed by much more profound changes in other sectors, for example, in manufacturing. And this is what we are going to hear about today. The COVID crisis is actually a good illustration to the topic, demonstrating that if companies and medical or educational establishments start to use web-based services, then this actually changes the whole logic of provision and consumption of the services. And for example, right now there is a discussion in Estonia that should we really return to the school days as they were, divided into 45 minutes lessons. And I'm delighted to say that I am accompanied today by Marcus Ballinger, Manager of Strategic Foresight at Policy Horizons Canada. And his interests and responsibilities include, for example, geostrategic issues, changes in the global energy landscape, sustainability, infrastructure, and of course, the next digital economy. I regret to say that Kristel Van der Elst, Director General of the Policy Horizons, has not yet managed to join us, but I hope that she will join us in the following minutes. And she is the CEO of the Global Foresight Group, in addition to being Director General of the Policy Horizons Canada. And she also is a fellow at the Center for Strategic Foresight of the US Government Accountability Office and visiting professor at the College of Europe. And she has been active in strategic foresight and policy advisory for 20 years, working with senior executives and policymakers. So I hope she'll make it to the line pretty soon. And last but not least, we have today with us Taavi Rõivas, ex-Prime Minister of Estonia in the years 2014 to 16. And right now, the Parliament member and the Vice Chairman of Reform Party faction in the Parliament. And with his vast experience in politics and policy making, he's the perfect person to comment the topic of the next digital economy from the point of view of Estonian policy making. And thank you for joining us. Thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Taavi. Now about how do we proceed. First, I'll ask Kristel, but Marcus has said he can do it as well, to have a few words about Policy Horizons, and especially what role does the strategic foresight play in the Canadian government and governance. And then he will continue with the next digital economy presentation. And let's see whether Kristel will join us to take over at some point of time. After the presentation, I'll give floor to Taavi Rõivas for comments and reflections. And then we should have time for questions and answers and discussion. Please use the Q&A button on the lower part of the screen to write your questions, and I'll pick them from there. And without further ado, I'm glad to give the floor over to you, Marcus, please.
Thank you, Tia. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. Well, to be here virtually, at least. I'm here in Ottawa at the moment. So unfortunately, it seems that Kristel has had some difficulties connecting this morning. So I will give both parts of the presentation. If you just allow me to share my screen, we'll get started. Okay, so let me just, there we go. So a brief introduction to Policy Horizons Canada. What we are is a Government of Canada strategic foresight group. Our job is to develop future-oriented policy and programs, or to help the government produce future-oriented policy and programs that are robust and resilient in the face of disruptive change. The way we do that is using a strategic foresight methodology that we've developed in-house. And the basic methodology we use is to start with weak signals of change that are happening in the world today. We play those out over, oh, I see Kristel's joined us. Perhaps Kristel, perhaps we'll just pause and let Kristel.
Yeah, I suggest we wait for some seconds for Kristel to turn on the audio and video.
Sure. Good morning, Kristel.
Oh, hello, Kristel. It's absolutely great that you could manage to join us. And I've already introduced you. And yeah, Marcus was so kind to start off with the presentation, but the floor is all yours now.
I only got into the first less than 30 seconds. So if you want to start, the screen is up and it's on the first slide to describe Policy Horizons Canada. So if you'd like to take over, you're my guest. You're unmuted.
Sorry about that. It's more complicated than walking into a room. Thank you very much. So yes, so I'm Kristel from Policy Horizons. So Policy Horizons is really the federal hub within the federal government that does foresight. So we're really looking at kind of how the policy landscape might change, whether this is from a social perspective, environment, economic, technological, etc. And what we're trying to do is really to help the policymakers who do make the decisions, it's obviously not us, who make the decisions, to make decisions that make sense kind of in the future context in which their decisions will be playing out and hopefully have the hoped for effects, rather than just anchoring their decision making kind of in the past and in the current state. So we do a lot of analysis, and Marcus is here today to present to you one of a major key piece in our economic foresight activities. We have a lot of engagements with public servants and the decision makers, because of course it's good to do a lot of analysis. If it doesn't really hit the people who make the decisions and you can engage with them on it, then it's just an intellectual exercise. So we spend a whole lot of time working with people also. And then we're also having a foresight literacy and capacity building training that we're doing with the public service. So we're working really across the federal government in the sense that the topics, and you'll see that later, the topics that we're covering is never the topic of one specific department or one specific area. It's always some of those very big systemic changes that we might see, because our mandate is government-wide. And so we're managed by a committee of deputy ministers, which in Canadian context, that means kind of for every department, on top of every department, just under the elected minister, you have a deputy minister. And so we have 12 of those on our board, and 2 people from the Privy Council, which is the administrative side of the Prime Minister's office. So this allows us to get very good guidance on how we can be valuable, and it also allows us to have a great space actually to develop some, to leave some of the thinking that we have. So you can swap the slides. So this is just to give you an idea of what you can get. You can get from us also. In the Horizons, in the Foresight research, we have about like 14, 15 people who do real deep research. Marcus' team has last year published also the next digital economy, what he's going to talk about today, and the future of work. Two pieces that are quite linked. You can find them online. This year, we've been doing a lot of work, Marcus again, on the biodigital convergence, really thinking about when these two systems come together, what kind of new futures might we see. And so also that is available online. The other space that we just put available online is the social futures. So how can society really where are some of those future fault lines in society? We're also working on technological leadership, and mainly now you can imagine all of our time is kind of spent on the long-term implications of COVID-19, both from a research perspective as conversations with the policymakers. Unique to the foresight capabilities of Canada, I would argue, is the huge investment in our team in outreach and communication. I think and on an international level, we have the biggest foresight outreach and communications team. So we have an internal foresight network. Everyone who does foresight, even at 5% on his desk, to say so, somewhere in the departments is part of that network. So we kind of stimulate the foresight brain and the muscle within the whole of the government, not just with us. We do trainings. We'll have a Futures Week, and of course we're having a lot of input to different processes, like the COVID decisions for the moment. So I'll let you visit our website if you want to have more information, or come back to us on the other topics. So Marcus, so one more thing then about the next digital economy. So that work actually that Marcus will be presenting now really is a reflection of how the economy might change if a broad suite of technologies is going to mature and combine, and it will change the real structural principles of the economy. It's work that has the whole idea is what you will see is kind of one scenario, I would call it. It's one way where the future might be going. And it has provided a lot of value within at least the Canadian context, as it's been used by decision makers to look at a lot of the social and economic policy suites and kind of test them for these type of futures. So were this future to happen that will be exposed to you by Marcus is, do we have the right tools? Do we have the right tools in our policy suite? Because as one of our deputy ministers would say, you know, we know how to increase kind of programs, how to put more money against things that we know, kind of to, you know, push up what we know. But what's really difficult is that suddenly when you arrive in a situation you hadn't expected, you don't have the policy tools available. At the same time, you have to scale them up. So you have to invent and scale at the same time. That's really hard. And so that's where the value of foresight comes in a lot. It's like, let's imagine some of these very plausible, very challenging futures. And by thinking about what it might look like, think about the tools that we have, so that when we end up in that situation, well, we can see it coming and we can be prepared for it. So that's kind of the whole philosophy behind the work that we're doing. And it's in that light you have to see the presentation. It's completely plausible. It might be challenging, but a completely plausible future. Is it the only possible? No, it's not, but it's one that government has to contemplate to be ready for the future. So, and I will leave it there and hand it over to Marcus.
Thank you, Kristel. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with you some of our recent work on economic foresight. The deck that I'm presenting today is an introduction to our work on the next digital economy. As you could see, it was based on a report that we released in June of last year that's available on our website if you'd like to read it. And we'll leave the URL for the website with you at the end of the presentation. So what's the context for this presentation? Well, as Kristel said, the Policy Horizons mandate includes identifying systems that may be undergoing significant and potentially disruptive change, and then exploring how changes in that system could play out so that our government can be better prepared if those futures actually are the ones that come to pass. Now, we definitely see the economy as a system undergoing change. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, we were finding both weak and confirming signals that suggested that in the next 10 to 15 years, we could see a significant amount of change in how the economy works, and by extension, that the world of work could also change significantly with significant impacts on employers and employees. That was before COVID-19. What we're seeing now is a very rapid acceleration of some of the effects, things like telework that we expected to see play out over a period of maybe 10 years have played out in a period of 10 weeks. Now, depending on the duration of the pandemic, we may see other effects and potential impacts that we identified accelerating as well. I'll note these as we go through the slides where it seems appropriate. So, what is the mainline story in the next digital economy paper? It is that digital economies are quite literally taking apart the economic world that we know. These technologies are allowing us to unbundle the factors of production and offering new ways to put them back together. Now, the factors of production I'm talking about include many types of labor, both physical labor as well as mental labor. It includes intellectual capacity, like knowledge and expertise, and it also includes the physical capital that's traditionally held in assets within a firm or an organization, things like machinery, equipment, and buildings. In the world of goods, we could see a shift from globally oriented mass production that's based on economies of scale to one that's based on localized production of increasingly customized one-off goods. We could see a similar shift in the world of services, where we shift from a relatively standardized suite of offerings to highly customized services tailored to the specific needs and circumstances of individuals. So we could see significant changes also in the type and nature of work, in the relationship between employees and employers, and the way in which we work, and the places in which we work. So I'll be giving a thumbnail view of the drivers that are creating the next digital economy and how they can combine to create a different economic architecture than the one that we have now. I'll follow that with a fairly high-level run-through of some policy implications. Now, as Kristel noted, we are a government foresight organization, so the policy implications that I'm going to present are tailored towards government areas of responsibility, but it's probably not a very large leap to see how they impact non-government entities as well. So, what's driving the next digital economy? We looked at a number of technologies that are emerging, maturing, and combining to become the basic infrastructure of the next digital economy. To pick out a few from this list. Advanced materials, including biomaterials, are going to allow us to create objects that are very small and very smart. We can spread these across both the built and the natural landscape, eventually extending the Internet of Things to pretty much anywhere that there are things. The data that these objects will pull in can be used to train artificial intelligence, or AI, which could potentially automate all algorithmic cognitive labor. And it turns out that a lot of what we think of as knowledge work is actually algorithmic or machine learnable. And AI is actually going to acquire a body through robotics, so it will be able to extend its reach into the physical world. With advanced telepresence, we'll be able to project ourselves and our expertise anywhere in the physical, virtual, or mixed worlds that are connected to networks. And we can do that irrespective of borders. So long as there's connectivity, you're in that world. Many objects, as small as smart dust, as elaborate as human organs, or even as large as buildings, may be 3D printed in factories that are locally situated near markets and able to be rapidly reconfigured for different outputs. Some of the materials that run through these multi-purpose factories will be produced by synthetic biology, essentially custom designed and created organisms. And finally, and crucially for making all of these parts work, blockchain technologies are going to allow us to create unique, non-copyable digital assets, which is why you can use blockchain to create money like Bitcoin. But you can also use it to create anything of value, like a contract or an invoice, and you can digitally verify its authenticity. So the blockchain enables secure, trusted, and low-cost digital transactions between humans and machines which do not know each other. So let's look at a few examples of these technologies quickly. So the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is about smart devices, something that many people know about and already use. They're essentially a physical thing that includes software and has connectivity. As a result, they can act or they can be acted upon remotely often without any human intervention. But what about all the legacy things, the dumb devices that are in there? That's going to slow us down. Well, this device can be connected to those things and adds the smart component. Looking at artificial intelligence, it's rapidly advancing. We hear something new and interesting about AI pretty much every day. So there's an increasing number of things that AI can do, including things that might have traditionally been thought of as uniquely human, like creating art. So this is a painting created by an AI that analyzed all of the work of Rembrandt and then created this new original work in Rembrandt style. Maybe it's just me, but it kind of looks like Mark Zuckerberg. I think that's probably a coincidence, but it's a bit uncanny. Robotics. So industrial robots are something that we're all pretty familiar with, but they're now leaving the factory. This is Spot. It's a dog-like robot from Boston Dynamics that can operate autonomously in complex environments. It has stereoscopic vision, automatic whiteness detection systems, and a grip that can pick up, carry, or manipulate objects. It can walk upstairs, it can open doors, it can carry packages on its back up to 14 kilograms, and it can even pull things behind it. They can be used in high-risk environments where it would be dangerous for a human. For example, it's being tested on a Norwegian offshore oil rig this year, where they expect to use Spot with onboard sensors to detect and respond to gas leaks. It essentially provides onshore operators with a telepresence on the rig out at sea without them actually having to be on the rig. So they've tested Spot in simulated environments that it might find on the oil rig, and they found that it could actually reach locations that humans can't. So it's actually better than human in some cases. So that's a pretty high-end application, but Spot can also be used for mundane tasks like package delivery, because if you think about it, it can climb the stairs to your front door, or it can open the door to your apartment building and take the elevator up to your floor. And in the context of COVID-19, it was recently used to patrol a park in Singapore, reminding people to maintain social distance, which is kind of funny. This is a Komatsu heavy hauler. It's used in open pit mining operations in the Pilbara region of Australia. They're remotely controlled from an air-conditioned office over 1,000 kilometers away. And an operator can monitor and control several of these at the same time. They're also being deployed in Canada's oil sands operations. As you can see from people standing around it, these things are absolutely huge. But what I want to draw your attention to is the lack of a cab. There's no place for a human on this machine. It can only be operated remotely. It cannot be operated by humans sitting in it. The last technology that I want to show you is this one. This is Microsoft's HoloLens augmented reality headset. And what this can do is it can overlay images on the wearer's field of view. You can anchor that image in space if you want to, so that you can look away from it and then return to it. You could actually create a screen in one room, walk out of the room to do something else, and then return to the room and you'll find the screen where you left it. It also has cameras and microphones and speakers that allow someone else to log into the headset and see and hear what you see and hear and talk to you in real time. You can open the screen to see them, like you see the mechanic doing in the picture here. That remote person, the person on the screen, can also mark up your field of view, the wearer's field of view. Like they could draw an arrow or a circle around something they want to draw your attention to. So these are real, and they're in the world now. They're currently used by, for example, ThyssenKrupp elevator repair mechanics. And they use them to call up manuals and instructions or to speak to a technical expert while they're in the field working on elevators. This is version 1. It's been out since, actually this is version 2. Version 1 has been out since 2016. Version 2 has been developed and is in testing, including by the US military. So the US military version, or US Army version, is expected to be finalized in 2021, next year. And it will include color see-through digital display that allows you to access information without actually taking your eyes off the battlefield. It will have thermal and low light sensors that make it possible for soldiers to see in the dark. And when it's teamed with a smart rifle, it will allow the shooter to aim at a target using a virtual sight, just like a video game. You don't actually have to look through the sight of the weapon to aim it. So I expect that advances from the military application and the scale of purchases, which is potentially 100,000 or so by 2028, will likely drive down the cost and improve the usability of consumer and prosumer models of these headsets. So I'm just going to put it out here, but I personally think that this technology is a sleeper that not many people are thinking of, but it has the potential to dramatically disrupt things, particularly for a type of work that relies on applying physical expertise in physical environments, and that's people working with machinery or equipment, and also to some degree with other humans. And I can explain why that happens in Q&A if someone wants to ask me about it then. But I also think that they may become as common as and potentially replace our smartphones in the not too distant future. So why am I showing these things? Why is the little tech tour? It's to demonstrate that the technologies that we're talking about are not ones that are coming in the future. It's to reinforce that they are here, now, today. The world of the next digital economy that I'm going to describe doesn't need anything new. Much of it can and is being built with stuff that we already have. And as that stuff gets better, the rate of adoption will likely accelerate, as will the breadth of adoption. So how does the next digital economy work? What does it look like? Well, in the next digital economy, we see both cognitive and physical labor being broken down into discrete tasks that are performed using networks that connect humans and machines from anywhere to anywhere. We think manufacturing could be highly automated, and much of it could be reshored. We think that value chains could be pulled together quickly from an on-demand pool of resources. And this is one of the key elements of this. Constructing value chains in the next digital economy, it may be less like building your own single product assembly line and more like reaching into a box of repurposable resources, connecting them digitally for as long as you need them to produce the good or service that you require, and throwing all of those blocks, those repurposable blocks, back into the box for someone else to use as part of an entirely different value chain. So if that's the case, what matters is access to this unbundled pool of factors of production rather than owning them. And this priority of access could be true for both firms as well as for consumers. So we've already seen some of the sharing economy on the consumer side. We see a similar trend potentially happening on the manufacturing and services side. So instead of focusing on specialized products or production at scale, firms might actually offer a broad scope of customized goods and services to client populations that they get to know very well. We could also see that providing data discovery and trust in transactions becoming a built-in part of the general infrastructure of the economy. And if that's the case, then those things, data discovery and providing trust facilities, are no longer specific value propositions that intermediaries can provide. So services that do that, like banks, brokerages, and lawyers, may be squeezed out of the equation. Importantly, we think that production costs and consumer prices could be significantly lower, particularly for digital goods or hybrid physical digital goods, where the majority of the value is in the digital component of the good. And this is because the marginal cost of producing and distributing digital goods, or the digital elements of one of those mixed goods, is really low, or perhaps even approaching zero. So what might the next digital economy look like? Let me try to create a more holistic sense of some potential disruptions that we see coming in the next digital economy. We see many firms could face really fierce competition and really ultra low profit margins. As I said, the cost of producing a digital good is marginal cost of producing a digital good is very low. So we could see a lot of competition in that space, very thin profit margins. Firms potentially trying to capture larger market share, but on very thin margins. Firms are not going to focus on corralling resources like they may have in the past, but rather on exploiting many short-run opportunities. The value chains, because of its ability to connect and disconnect the factors of production digitally, the value chains might be ephemeral, essentially built on the fly for highly specific, very customized goods or services, and then the value chain is solved by disassembling the digital connections between those repurposable factors of production that were used to produce that good or service. If that's the case, firms may be intentionally built to last only a short time, with no expectation that they're going to grow from a small to a medium to a large enterprise. Also, because of this structure, firms could have very few formal employees, and any employees that they do have may be on short-term contract, and they could be scattered across the globe. Now, depending on competition laws and data protection laws, it's possible that a small number of giant firms could capture much of the information generated in this economy. And given data's role as what you could call the raw material from which digital goods and services are created, these giant firms may also capture much of the profits. And this is why if we're looking to have a more equal distribution, things like competition law and data protection laws will be very significant factors in how that plays out. We might find that firms that produce digital goods or services for your market have a minimal or even no physical footprint in your country, or any country for that matter. And that's because data is the asset, and data is weightless. Unlike, say, an automobile manufacturer that has capital in the form of physical machinery that has to be ripped out of a physical building to change the production location, a digitally driven company can move its productive assets to a server anywhere in the world in just a few mouse clicks. So let's talk about workers. They come under pressure as machines displace humans in many tasks. And they can do this long before the machine can do their whole job. So what they do is replace part of the worker first, and over time, perhaps the entire worker. This is important in terms of employment, because if I can replace half of 2 workers now, I only need 1 worker. The machine takes care of the other one. So I don't have to replace both workers in their entirety, replace 1/2 of each, and then I only need 1 worker to do the other 2 halves that remain. We could see machine-centered design and hybrid machine/human arrangements accelerating this. This is sometimes referred to as sort of centaur work, but rather than half horse or half human, it's a human worker who can do more by being paired with a machine or with digital technology. Workers could also find themselves in a competitive global talent pool in which wages converge across jurisdictions. If you think about it, if your employer has access to people from anywhere in the world, you are competing with everyone else in the world with the same skill set as you. And the people you're competing with may live in a region of the world with a much lower cost of living. So they can underbid you. And this may be great if you're a worker living in India or Bangladesh, but it's not so much a good thing if you happen to live in Canada, where the cost of living is relatively high. We expect the service sector to be among the first to experience the early effects of the transformation to the next digital economy. We already see AI solutions poised to displace human work in many roles in accounting, insurance, finance, and legal professions. We're seeing robots replacing labor. That's already a reality in many manufacturing environments. But over time, robotics like Spot, for example, seem poised to provide replacements for workers by providing services in less structured environments like hospitals, warehouses, logistics centers, restaurants, and delivery services. And in delivery services, I would also include moving people in autonomous vehicles. And we also expect them to enter into the household. We already see that in some jurisdictions, places like Japan. In the manufacturing sector, as I said, highly distributed factories close to markets could 3D print or otherwise build a vast range of goods from standard biological, mineral, plastic, and synthetic raw materials. So when the goods that are produced have a digital element, this is the physical digital hybrids, a software update can add new features and functions to that object without additional manufacturing required. So the smartphone that most of us have is a good example. It's not really a phone. What it is more aptly described as is a portable, repurposable computer platform with sensors and input and output interfaces and connectivity. It can be any number of things just by tapping an icon to launch software. You can actually use it as a phone, but really that's only about 1% of what I use it for, and I think many people are probably in the same boat. Another example is the Tesla automobile, which can have new features downloaded overnight through its onboard internet connection. So essentially you can wake up in the morning to an improved, a new car with a new feature without actually having to take it to a dealer or have anything physically do it. So let's move into the natural resources sector. This is a sector that's actually pretty important for Canada. We already see signs of automation and remote control of machinery in mining, forestry, and oil and gas projects. I showed you the Komatsu heavy hauler, but there are many other examples. What is interesting from an employment perspective is that a lot of the natural resources in Canada are in relatively remote locations. And these operations are an important source of local employment and economic development. Before automation, basically local jobs were only lost when the resource got used up or became unprofitable. But with automation, we could see profitable natural resource extraction continue to happen without any local jobs. The jobs are actually in that air-conditioned office 1,000 kilometers away, or maybe even across the world. Synthetic biology could be a real disruptor here, potentially offering alternative sources of products that we normally extract from natural resources, so things like plant fibers for paper or textiles, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, proteins, building materials, and oils. So, what are the challenges and opportunities in the next digital economy? So, even before COVID-19, we thought we were in the early stages of a significant, potentially profound economic transition, and that it could be as disruptive as previous major economic transitions. I'm thinking of the industrial revolutions or the early digital revolution. So with COVID-19, we see that, well, it looks likely to increase the amplitude of this disruption by acting as an accelerant of change. As I said earlier, we're seeing advances in some areas like telework that we thought would take 10 years or more compressed into months. I mean, as an example, practically the entire federal public service of Canada, which is almost 300,000 people, went from working in an office to working from home basically overnight. And 90% of it was up and running and actually rolling out new programs within days. We've already seen many companies announcing that they're going to give up their offices. They've seen no decline in the effectiveness of their workforce, and they're frankly wondering if they're spending millions of dollars on commercial rents. Technologies like Zoom that we're using today have suddenly become commonplace. I mean, I had Zoom beer with a colleague the other day. And a lot of conferences are shifting to be virtual events. These changes are likely to replace a significant amount of business travel and have a significant impact on hospitality-related sectors as well. We see online shopping was already growing as a trend pre-COVID-19, but we've seen it accelerate and also expand into new areas, particularly into groceries, for example. And firms are looking at automation quite significantly. And the reason they're doing that is partly to reduce costs, but also to remove humans from production facilities, because robots don't get COVID-19 and don't shut down your operations. So COVID-19 is a game changer in an area that was already, in an era that was already seeing the game being changed. It's taking expected changes and collapsing the timelines for them dramatically. So that's not about COVID-19 in general. So I'm going to move into the specifics now. So if the economy evolves to more closely resemble the next digital economies I've described, there will be impacts beyond the economy. And these impacts will affect a range of policy areas, and they'll create both challenges and opportunities. So from a government perspective, some of the more obvious policy and program areas are shown on this slide. And it's important to think through how different areas will be impacted so that we can make appropriate interventions to address the challenges, but also to seize the opportunities. There are challenges, but it's not all bad. There are also opportunities. Now, clearly, this type of work can't and it shouldn't be done in a vacuum. Although there's a clear role for government, I say we need to address the challenges to seize the opportunities. I'm referring to all actors in society, not just governments. So let's take a look at these, starting with economic development. I mean, clearly it makes sense to be staying on the cutting edge of the technologies that are driving change. It's hard to predict the jobs that will spin out from them 10 to 15 years from now. Look back 10 to 15 years, a lot of jobs that exist today that just weren't on people's radar or even imagination back then, and we don't see it being any different going forward. But you know, if you are staying on the cutting edge, you're in the game, and you can get some advanced warning and potentially some early mover advantage. It's the same deal for the technologies themselves and where they go. So clearly, the route Estonia is taking here on information management falls into that area. Good digital infrastructure is clearly a key factor in this next digital economy, but we shouldn't assume that creating or expanding our digital infrastructure in Canada is actually going to create jobs here. Because platform-based gig work and advanced telepresence means that the talent we need can be sourced from anywhere in the world. But that works both ways. So Canadians could also provide talent to the world in areas where we have particular expertise or a comparative advantage. So given that idea that you basically can source the information that you need from anywhere in the world, or that you are in Canada and can provide it to anywhere in the world, maybe we should look as part of our economic development strategy at how we get qualified people to come to Canada. Not necessarily because they're earning money here or have jobs here, but because they're spending money here. Because spenders are what supports your secondary economy. And the secondary economy is important because it's the one with a lot of jobs for people who might have lower skills or abilities. So Canada, we already have good reasons for people to come here, but maybe part of our economic development strategy is to make it even better by investing in physical infrastructure and social capital that makes Canada a really attractive place to come and live regardless of where you work. In other words, where you earn your money. So this is a strategy that goes from trying to put people in seats at work to one that puts them in beds in their homes. Now, we may have additional considerations that have to be taken into account if there's a persistent problem with COVID that makes immigration more complex, but that's another layer that would have to be applied to this situation. Moving to employment and skills development. We saw the potential for persistent structural unemployment and jobless recoveries before COVID. COVID has just brought that perhaps into more stark focus than we would have without COVID. And the reason that we're worried about this is that jobs that disappear in a downturn might not come back when the economy picks up again, because in the interim, digital technologies took over that work. And historically, downturns have accelerated the adoption of technologies that reduce labor costs. So these sort of trends are clearly amplified by the current situation. The question is, are there residual skills that are really hard to replace with technology? And the answer is yes, there are. They tend to be soft skills, things like empathy, judgment, and creativity. And these are actually personal attributes more than skills per se. They're inherent, or they've been picked up through long periods of socialization. These aren't things that you can just go and take a 2-week online course at a local community college and suddenly pick up, empathy, judgment, and creativity. So we don't know if these attributes, these soft skills, will be amplified by the societal response to COVID-19. We might find that people recognize their importance and invest in them. So where there is work, we think the shift to a global market for labor means that Canadians will be competing with everywhere else in the world that has the same skills. And as I said, many of them will live in places with significantly lower cost of living, allowing them to continuously underbid Canadian workers, to the point that a Canadian worker may not actually be able to afford to take that work. They may not be able to make a living wage, given the cost of living in Canada doing that work, in comparison to someone in a lower cost jurisdiction. The concern there is that we could be training or reskilling Canadians for work that is theoretically available, but they can't make a living wage at it because of global competition. And in that respect, it becomes a bit of a stranded asset. So moving on to trade policy. So we've seen an increase in border measures like tariffs on physical goods and materials over the last couple of years. It's no secret that there's a significant trade tension between the US and China. And Canada is particularly impacted because we are a very export-dependent country, and the US is our largest trading partner by far. But as the digital economy continues to take hold, an increasing amount of the value going across borders is going to be trade in digital goods or information, and much of it will be peer-to-peer. That could make it really difficult to impose traditional tariffs, quotas, or non-tariff barriers. It's very difficult to intercept something. You can't stop it at the border like you can a physical good. given that, we see two potential options. One is essentially the emergence of de facto free trade, at least in digital goods. But the other alternative scenario is that we don't see that. And the reason we wouldn't see that is if competing economic actors intentionally create incompatible standards so that you're essentially locked into their digital trade block or locked out of competitors. It's kind of like the iOS versus Android walled garden effect, but on a global scale. Moving on to social support programs. So the standard employee-employer relationship may not be the norm in the next digital economy. As we said, there'll be a lot of work on digital platforms. Working gigs on a global tasking platform doesn't pay benefits. And as a government, you get no employer contribution from the employer to support your social or income support programs. So we also see the potential for income inequality to go up, even if prices go down. And I'll try and explain why. So lower prices are good for everybody, but they're even better for some. And that's because digitization will not likely be even across sectors across time. So if you happen to be in one of those sectors and working in a job that hasn't been digitized yet, and it still pays relatively well, you will be increasingly better off compared to those who continue to lose wages, even if your income stays the same. As prices goes down, you will have increased spending power compared to others. So this inequity could lead to calls to redistribute income, employment, or assets to people whose lost income has not been offset by declining prices. And we think that there could be a significant intergenerational tension in this area, with many of the people in the old economy having done well and amassed a certain amount of income, assets, and seniority, with new people finding it increasingly difficult to enter and being at comparative disadvantage with a lot of downward pressure on wages. The other thing to think in this social support thing is that the work is more than just a way to earn money for many people. It can provide a sense of purpose, status, belonging, things of that nature. Excuse me. If work disappears or changes dramatically, we have to think about how people find the non-monetary things that, that work used to provide for them. Moving on to regulations. So you remember in the thing on trade, I said that a lot of the value crossing borders will be digital and it will be peer-to-peer. So how do we handle people importing digital files and 3D printing things locally that don't meet your environmental, consumer safety, or health standards? How do you create and enforce regulations around things like that? We could also find that enforcing labor standards could be very tough. In a global labor market that pays by task often rather than by the hour, how do we enforce minimum wages or maximum hours of work or even the minimum working age? How do I know for sure that the person that I've hired on a tasking platform is not underage, not a child? If we look at things like IP production, the cost of entry into digital production is quite low, making it easy to develop identical offerings using a parallel but distinct path. So once the idea is out in the world, you don't necessarily need to copy the code because you could develop an alternate code that provides the same service or good. Think about Uber and Lyft. They're identical ride-sharing services, but using completely different apps. And the last area in regulation that I want to touch on is privacy and the use of data. These are issues now, and they're likely to get only more complex going forward. We're seeing a lot of talk right now about using people's data, collecting data for tracking and contact tracing in the context of COVID. If that sticks, it's an important source of data, and the questions are who owns that data, who has access to that data. Let's move on to environment. From an environmental perspective, we might find enforcement could be a lot harder if you have this higher number of small and dispersed manufacturing facilities. Certainly harder to monitor than a smaller number of large facilities. But there are upsides. So the local production certainly reduces transportation impacts, including carbon emissions and habitat destruction from transportation infrastructure. Another thing that's interesting about digital economy is that it runs on electricity, not on petroleum. So if the electricity is from non-emitting sources, that could certainly be an improvement. It's actually a pretty good thing for Canada, although we produce and export oil. A lot of our electricity is from non-emitting sources, so we may have a comparative advantage in that respect. There's also the trend to dematerialization that comes with this idea of repurposability. So this is that devices can take on multiple functions without changing their physical form, just by changing the software. So smartphones are a great example of that. They replace lots of things that would have had a separate physical form even 10 years ago. I also talked about Teslas being upgraded by software, but we're seeing this trend now in things like home appliances. You can upgrade them by downloading improved software rather than replacing them. So people may end up having fewer things and they may hang on to them longer. So that could be an environmental benefit on both the natural resource draws, but also on the waste disposal side. And blockchains, I know Estonia's quite familiar with blockchains, but we see the potential, well, we're already seeing it, but we see increased potential of blockchains to track the origin and the environmental sustainability of raw materials and products throughout the entire supply chain. And that could lead to more informed and environmentally friendly decisions by producers and consumers because they know the provenance and history of the products that they are using or consuming. Move into taxation. Taxation could be a real problem. People in places like the OECD are looking at this, and it's challenging. There's no question. When an economic activity is global and it's digital, it's really hard to determine when value is created, and if you can, what part happens in your tax jurisdiction. Even if you can figure those things out, we could in the future see lower income taxes because, as I said, wages are potentially falling. We could see lower corporate taxes because profits are being eroded by competition. And we could see lower value added taxes because of dematerialization and lower prices, fewer things being bought, and the prices of those are also going down. So we move into fiscal policy, which is often tied to tax policy. We could create a perfect storm, basically, in which tax revenues are falling at the same time as demands in the fiscal framework are increasing because more and more people and potentially corporations are looking for government support during the transition to the next digital economy. The last point on this slide is that it may be difficult, or certainly more difficult, for governments to run deficits in economic slowdowns because there will be less certainty about the ability to pay them down in the future. So it makes it challenging to do long-term fiscal planning. Now, I wrote the points on this slide pre-COVID. The pandemic and the need to provide emergency funding measures to basically support huge numbers of people out of work is just amplifying and accelerating these challenges that we saw coming. Let's move on to measurement. So the relevancy of traditional metrics like GDP has been under debate for quite a while. But a shift to an advanced digital economy may make a metric like GDP increasingly less relevant. We could see consumer welfare going up significantly for a lot of things, particularly if they're a digital nature, because prices are going down. As I said, marginal costs of production and distribution of digital goods and services are really low. But if prices are going down, that would mean GDP would be going down too. So on one hand, things are getting better, they're getting cheaper, but GDP is going down. So how do we square that with our traditional ideas about what constitutes a successful economy? Given that, we should be mindful that some of the investments that we make to specifically try and increase GDP may actually decrease welfare. I also talked earlier about the potential for there being a significant unevenness across the economy. So different rates of digital disruption across sectors. Given that, it may be that aggregate measures like GDP might not have the granularity that we need to make appropriate policy interventions or investment decisions at a more sectoral level. And I keep talking about declining prices. So it's actually possible that in aggregate, these declines could trigger disinflation and even potentially deflation. And most of our monetary instruments are geared towards controlling inflation. And it's not clear how well prepared we would be for an extended deflationary environment, either in Canada or elsewhere in the world. The last slide, I want to remind you that digitization doesn't happen to the whole world or even to the whole economy. I mean, there's still value in real world materials and in non-digital work. I mean, I can't eat a digital apple and I can't stay warm in a virtual reality apartment. Where value persists in the face of digital technologies is a question that we're working on now, and we're hoping to release a report on that in the fall. The last point on this slide is more of a high-level question of values as opposed to value in a monetary sense. If you think about most economic modeling, we assume that there's a scarcity and that we have to compete for resources to win. You think about every time you've heard a statement, even from your own department, that starts with something like, we need to build a strong and competitive economy. But what if the ability to create additional units of digital goods and services at almost zero costs means that we go from scarcity to abundance, or at least to sufficiency? We may find that there's fewer zero-sum games, both in our dealings with each other and with other nations. And it could be that for some things, cooperation between nations could produce great benefits for the citizens of both countries than competition between countries would. And I'm wondering if this could be maybe a more common approach, particularly as digitization continues to blur geographic boundaries and our concepts of nationality and citizenship. And Estonia seems to be on that track with things like your e-citizenship. And I'd like to take that opportunity sometime in the future to explore that more with you. So that's the end of my presentation. I'll turn it back to our host for some reflections, and then I believe we have time for some Q&A. So over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marcus. Such a vast amount of insights and very far-reaching, and I would like to ask many things, but I'm gonna withhold my questions and comments, and I'd like to give floor to Taavi Rõivas, please. You're welcome.
Thank you, Tea, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Marcus, for very interesting presentation. It's no secret that in Estonia we talk a lot about those topics, but it's really great and interesting to get the Canadian perspective, which we don't get every day. And my first remark would be that the trends that are happening, be it AI and robotics changing the world, be it the way we work, be it the new business models, they seem to be absolutely universal, absolutely global, exact same things that are happening in Canada, just like you explained, they are exactly happening here in Europe as well. But of course, what is the difference is how different countries, and by that I mean even within Europe, how different countries either do react or don't react to the changes. Of course, the Estonian perspective is to see more opportunities than threats. Our view seems to be most of the time that if the government does not enable those new technologies, it is riskier than enabling. So enabling new technologies, of course, is also risky, but not enabling or ignoring those technologies or trends is more risky. So we should, in a way, understand what those changes are and why these are important. Now, you mentioned lots of things, and I just very, very briefly comment on only a couple of them. I agree that the way firms work, coming in the same order as you did, the resources that are very important have changed already. It used to be land to be the most important economic resource, then it was production resources, who owned most of that was the richest. And now it's increasingly data. And of course, there are already global companies that have taken immense benefits from that, but it increases to go in this direction. And of course, it's, as you correctly mentioned, it's very, very important question, who owns the data and how the services or corporate structures are designed. And just a small parallel from Estonian government services, it has been a clear decision for already quite some time that in government services or the data that government gathers about citizens is in vast majority of cases owned by the citizens themselves. So if they want to erase something, if they want to close something, it's their right then. And that's probably one of the secrets why Estonians are quite trustful for digital services. Now, the way workers or work changes, this is something that I think we feel most closely. It's quite clear that having digital technologies, be it Zoom, but be it many other things, it has enabled already and will, in my opinion, keep enabling totally new kinds of jobs. It used to only be from 9 to 5, or most people working from 9 to 5. But now there is all sorts of gig economies, all sorts of work bites, all sorts of, as you very correctly said, international cooperations. It doesn't matter anymore. And now after this COVID crisis, even less it matters whether you live in Canada or Estonia. It's acceptable to work in this format as we are discussing right now. And it's actually quite easy for us to form a team if we feel necessary. And I don't need to move to Canada. You don't move to Estonia for that. So that changes everything. And from government perspective, I think we need to understand that we cannot fit the new economic models, whatever they are, we cannot fit them to the old school labor movement or labor union and factory workers working legislation. So that also actually gives a different perspective, in my opinion, at least. And I agree that this is disputable, but my opinion is that those people who work with Uber or Bolt or Lyft, they can, if they want to be considered very easily as micro employees and like micro companies, and they could very easily take the charge of social benefits themselves. It's not necessarily the only view, as in many countries is predominant, that the company has to provide them similar guarantees as factory workers 100 years ago. I very much enjoyed the point you said about economies of scale versus economies of scope. Estonians are not totally unbiased in this. We believe that, and we like to believe that in the future, being very big and powerful is less important, and that there can be a competitive edge for small countries. In a way, small countries, like we like to say it in Estonia, can act as speedboats, not as oil tankers. And this we need to use together with other small countries, or in some cases in competition with other small countries, as our opportunity to matter. I mean, big countries matter anyways, but small countries need to be great in something in order to matter in a greater scale. Now, one question that you posed, and then with that I end. You said that, how do we know that someone is of age, or for that matter, who he or she claims to be at all, if the connection is over internet? Well, for that, Estonians have a solution. We have been using digital identity for almost 2 decades, and I really, really highly recommend that. It's a huge enabler, just like a credit card enabled us to do, and still actually enables, even though it's a technology from many decades ago, it still enables us to pay online, to pay remotely. The same can happen to identity if you design it properly, and that's one of the success stories that we cannot reiterate enough. And my very final point is that I fully agree that COVID brought us to a new context. If this doesn't speed up digital developments, then I don't know what does. The trends are already there. There has been some sort of resistance, in my opinion, from many politicians believing that, perhaps we can still live in the world that we are used to be. COVID showed us that in a matter of days, we have to snap ourselves out of the reality as we knew it, and there is a new reality. And I really do hope that that this gives us a good opportunity to actually catch the wave of digitalization. And with that, I end, and I thank Arenguseire Keskus Foresight Center, as it seems to be in English. I haven't used the English term before, for this very timely opportunity to discuss across Atlantic how the world could change. So thank you very much. And thank you very much, Kristel and Marcus, for your great presentation. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, great comments. Thank you so much. Well, I encourage all of our listeners to ask questions via Q&A bar on the bottom of the screen. And until the questions, I hope that there will be more. There are just a few of them at the moment. Until these questions will come, I would like to use the opportunity and ask that what about the policy implications of all this, and the government, I mean the policymakers, do they have to anticipate the change and try to build up new systems, new regulations in advance? Or is it more wise to be a bit more reactive? Because if you are too early, you might have backlashes from the society and from all, I mean, you have all this legacy and you have to tackle it gently. You can't be too harsh. What do you think? Who would like to speak up? Yeah, Kristel, please. Yeah.
Maybe just, so the way this has been used, kind of how we work with this in the Canadian context at least, is that, as I said in the beginning, you contemplate what might happen. You think about what would be needed by consequence. Do we have the right policies? What would we be doing? Do we need to devise new policy tools? You have to think about them. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to put them in place and like to roll them out big time. So we believe, I mean, and our policymakers, the way they work with this is really thinking, what do you need? And maybe start playing some small pilots and seeing how things work. For example, one of the areas that the Canadian government has used is they had identified that Canada is really good at training people while they're, going towards the job market. Education is really great. Canada is really good once people are outside of a job to get them back into the workplace, but there's not really great systems in place that help people educate while they're in the job, kind of, to get to that next job if theirs disappears. And so they have been thinking about kind of what is a policy tool that we need to kind of put that in place. That doesn't mean, so they're running pilots on this, they have created some kind of tools. That doesn't mean they put it in place big time. But if we get to a world where everyone happens, all these jobs suddenly disappear, all these like people become gig workers, etc., and we see really these trends happening, then they're kind of ready. Right? They're ready, they have thought about what would be the tools, and then the only thing they have to do is scale them up. So that's a bit of philosophy, is kind of think about what might happen so you can think about what you do so you don't have knee-jerk reactions when you're there. It doesn't mean that you have to scale it up all at once and put it in place, actually. Mm-hmm. Marcus, did you want to add to that?
Sure. I think it's important to realize that the governments do have, concerns of the day, and you can't basically just go directly into the future. So we're always working on sort of two timelines. There's how do we deal with what we need to deal with today, but also at the same time, how do we start building out the things that we need for the future? So there's always this sort of two-track thing. You can't turn government from a legacy system to a future system overnight. And the other thing that's important is we always try to play with a number of different scenarios of the future rather than one expected scenario. And the reason that that's very useful for a policymaker, decision maker to have in their head is because we may be going down a particular path thinking that, okay, we know where we're going. We think this is the future that's playing out. And then you suddenly realize at some point that you're actually not where you thought you were. If you haven't thought about other scenarios, then essentially you're lost. You don't know where you are. And that's a lot different from saying, oh, I'm not where I expected to be, but I do know where I am. I'm actually in that other scenario that we looked at previously. And now I know how to act in that scenario. So in a sense, you're preloading the ideas of, if this particular scenario happens, then I know what to do. So we don't actually have to develop the policy responses for every scenario, but we do have to have thought about what we would do if we were in that scenario. So in a sense, it gives you a sort of a pre-warning or an idea to think about what you would do if you turned out to be in somewhere different from where you expected to be.
Yeah, thank you for this point. We try to stress this too in the Foresight Center, as we work with scenarios, particularly for the same reason that you just mentioned. I turn to the questions from the audience, and there seems to be a huge concern about cybersecurity and well, how much can we actually trust the robots? They can get viruses too, perhaps different kind of viruses than humans. Do you think there is no new phase of digital economy without enhanced cybersecurity?
Want to take that, Marcus? Or
I can start, and you can certainly add to it. No, clearly, cybersecurity becomes a significant concern in this situation. Anytime that you are continuing to add connectivity and providing access to devices, then there has to be robust security layers on top of that. Without security layers or real opportunities for recourse in the case of a breach of cybersecurity, it's going to be difficult. There will, of course, be potential trade-offs. So we may not be able to have 100% robust systems in every situation, and there will have to be some sort of calibration, just like there is in every world. There is no 100% guarantee in policy and programming or in regulation. So we always have to assume that we will do whatever we can to ensure cybersecurity or to ensure the security of data, and being able to have trust that will be valued, and that in the case of a breach, you do have some recourse will be very important. Kristel, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, it just like the more we get, I mean, we learn, and certainly I find COVID has been very interesting in the sense that it's like a live pilot of kind of what, it's like you try to pilot like what would the world look like if we went all digital, and now we're suddenly forced to do it. So you can kind of see what works and what doesn't work, right? Not all the needs are met, not everything goes through digital, but a lot of things do go are very well served through digital. And so what we're seeing is that at the same time, there's your health outcomes of country, your economic outcomes, your social outcomes. They all going to depend in the future very heavily on this digital infrastructure. So the fact that you have it or not, that it is safe or not, it becomes really the digital infrastructure becomes for your country a strategic resource. Just like your energy system is, just like your transportation system is. It's those type of infrastructures that you need to protect, because they're kind of the basis of your economy, what your economy is sitting on, more than it used to be. And so that's kind of one aspect. I think there needs to be a bit of a review of kind of what is that digital, if it is so basic to kind of your economic development and your social development of your population. On the other hand, I also want to highlight some of the work Marcus has been doing on the biodigital. And there was a comment in the questions around that once we go more into we're thinking now about biological, this was a virus that's kind of biological. It might become a bit less biological and a bit less accidental, if we suppose it's accidental. And so we might see within the biodigital, with e-health, etc., a great need actually for cybersecurity, technological security, trust being built into these systems, because if a lot of our health system is going to start using actually the digital, which we've been talking about it like for ages, right? So it's not there yet, but it's going to get there fast. How are we going to manage that security risk actually? And so really looking not just at cybersecurity, but I think all aspects, including that digital identity. It's great to have digital identities. I see the complete benefit of it. The design of it is very important and matters. Digital identity can enable things. Digital identity can end up like being a policing mechanisms or whatever it is. It can end up being something that actually disadvantages you within society if it's badly designed, because now everyone, your insurance companies know about everything, and you can't get a health insurance anymore, because you have bad social background, which shows that you have less, good health outcomes. So it just like all these elements are super important, but they all need to be properly designed. And I think this is what our economies in the future are going to be, are going to depend on. We have to get very serious about thinking about all these elements.
Taavi, would you like to comment on this, especially on the digital identity of as we have done it in Estonia?
Yeah, you have a great example. You're actually a great role model for it. You're
muted.
Sorry for that. Well, thank you very much. I think it's quite clear that cybersecurity in a way is like basic hygiene. You cannot do anything without that. But having said that, there is always a kind of element of what we compare the digital systems against. Do we compare them against perfect world, or do we compare them with today's reality? I would argue that today's reality in many cases, if not most cases, in the analog world is less secure than in the digital world. It's much easier to break into my home or my office than break into my computer. If I keep my passwords at least more or less okay. And it's even more different if we say that which is harder to falsify, whether my handwritten signature, which I have been told that some 10-year-olds when they go to school they get away falsifying their parents' signatures. So how hard can it be for criminals, or to break my digital signature, which has the highest encryption that is known to us at this moment. So these are actually different things, and the same applies to health data. For example, the very unfortunate case of Michael Schumacher, a German that is well known on both sides of the Atlantic, I presume, and his medical record was stolen from a medical institution cellar on paper. So somebody went there and looked what's inside. And I think the person got caught. I'm not quite sure, but in the Estonian system, you could be 100% sure that you could get caught because we have all the logs. So if you log in, if you're a doctor, if you're a nurse, if you log into my health data, I will know that you had a sneak peek, and I can press charges if I didn't authorize that. So these kind of small questions in design can actually make it very safe. And I fully agree with this remark by Kristel that digital ID should not be used for social profiling or anything like that. There have to be very clear legal channels, what can be used for what, and it's not that in Estonia state knows more about me than in Canada or in any other country. It's just that sometimes digital information is easier to gather, but there still are legal restrictions. For example, police cannot know about my health, and my doctor cannot know about my income. So those things, legal walls are still there. Thank you very much.
I'd like to turn to some of the most intriguing insights, at least for me, and the most long-term insights of your research on the new next digital economy. I was most intrigued by the statement that the production costs will decline and we are going to have a kind of a concept of abundance and not anymore the situation of scarcity. And actually, I've heard the same about energy. There has been some arguing around foresight circles that we are going to face an era of abundant energy because the energy will be out of renewables, and marginal costs of renewables is zero. You know, the sun shines and wind blows absolutely free of charge. But it has always seemed me a little bit too optimistic because, I mean, there's a whole range of new costs actually. For example, utilization of the renewable energy equipment or the balancing issues in the grids, etc. So do you think that the perspective of radically decreasing production costs is really plausible?
So I think it is plausible in certain sectors. So so what we've seen is that in traditional types of manufacturing or supply chains, use of digitization or digital tools has certainly allowed, in many cases, the reduction of labor. So in often cases, digitization, use of algorithms, programs, and tracking systems has allowed us to take people out of the system. So there's been a reduction in cost there. Obviously, there's a cost in putting in the digital systems, but on the average, it's tended to be more cost effective. The place where I see, so I think you could say in general there would be potential for a lower cost. Where I see the potential for significantly lower costs is a continuing move to digitization of goods which previously had a physical form. So you actually talked earlier about music and photography. So if you think about, I mean, photography used to be a very expensive thing, and now it's free. I mean, people take photos of, I take photos of a license plate on my car that I've rented so that I can go punch it into the meter. I would never have done that with a 35mm camera because it would have been impossible. So things like photography, for example, have in essence become free. Music streaming and many forms of media have essentially become very, very low cost, approaching free. We see that in news media, in print media. And so the question is, if you start to think, well, how much of the world can I digitize? Then the cost of producing those goods or services can go down very low. We actually had an interesting conversation with someone looking at advances in augmented reality or virtual reality. And the question that we asked is, okay, what are the things that I can't digitize in a VR world? And essentially the question, it came down to, well, the only things, things that I have to touch are the only things that I still need. So I still need a coffee cup, I still need a chair, and I still need a box, 6 by 6, 3 meters by 3 meters by 3 meters. If I don't touch it, then it can be done digitally. It can be done through VR. And so when you start thinking in that sort of space, you can see, well, a lot of the things that we think we need in a physical form and have a value associated with them may be able to be produced digitally. So I think in that area, there's a significant potential. The degree to which that actually gets actualized will depend very much on whether there are frameworks in place in the form of laws, regulations, or say scale effects that allow companies that are providing these digital services to continue to extract high rents from the provision and not actually have a competitive force that drives the the costs down. So we may see that that the costs don't go down, but it won't be because it won't be because of the technology. It'll be because of some other framework which actually prevents the costs from going down, or enables the corporation that's providing that service to continue to extract a high rent.
Okay, anyway, it's good to see some optimism towards the future for us as a consumers, basically. Let's see how it will actually evolve. But one more aspect I would like to touch upon, and then we've got a few questions from the audience as well. The principle of access, not ownership. You said this is going to be predominant, which actually means that there is one more danger to the banks and financial system. Not only that the business models are built on acting as a trustee, a trusted party between the stakeholders, but this business model is going to be outdated because the trust can be created via technical means, peer-to-peer. But also, I mean, if the companies are not going to have physical equipment anymore, they are not going to have buildings, land size, etc. So, how the financial system will work? What would be used as a guarantees for financing loans and other forms of funding for the companies? So I do see that the financial sector needs to have a total restart, redesign. How do you see it?
Well, I think you're right. I think the place where the financial sector will certainly can potentially suffer is in the use of things like blockchains for payment channels and security of transactions. So both the legal and the financial sector, I think, will see potential disruption. Now, the question is, will they be open systems or will they be closed systems? We know a lot of banks are working very diligently to adopt and develop blockchain systems, but they're doing them in-house. And so if they're not accessible to the average person, then again, it's like I said about the cost of digital services going down. If the banks continue to preclude people from using them, then they are the interface, and they can maintain the high costs there. So they may be able to maintain profitability. If there are open source, publicly accessible channels to do the same thing, then they will come under some competition. To the point about sharing, I think so many of these factors of production, some of these do have physical form. So we're talking about 3D printers or biofoundries or bioreactors. I mean, they are still a physical thing. They're made of atoms. They have to be somewhere in the world. So there is capital expenditures that are required to purchase those, to maintain and operate them, and they have to be housed in a building. So there will continue to be expenditures, and companies can use traditional channels of financing, either through banks, through loans, or through issuing equities or bonds in those markets. I think where the interesting part is that because these things are repurposable, and because they are decentralized, you basically use them for the time that you need them. And then so rather than have a piece of equipment that you say is used only 50% of the time in your production facility, that could be owned by someone else, and it could be shared. With access to it could be shared. So your business proposition might be, I have a suite of 3D printers that can print in a variety of different materials at different sizes. And I just basically, you just rent them from me, for the period of time that you need. You could also be a company that does that, and so you have a facility that has a bunch of things in it, and if there's slack time, you're not using it, well, then you just open it up, you put it on a platform, and someone can make use of it. So what we're doing in that case is we're actually optimizing using digital platforms and connectivity. We're optimizing the productive value of all of the assets that we do have. So if that works very well, then clearly there would be an overall reduction in the number of assets that would be required, because each one is being optimized as opposed to having them suboptimally used in a number of locations. So you might see a contraction in the amount of capital expenditure or the amount of funding that people need over the longer term. Clearly, you need to ramp this up. There's going to be a need to invest in new capital, particularly if you're moving from a legacy manufacturing system into one of the new smart manufacturing or smart factory types of models.
Well, thanks for a comprehensive answer. We are actually a bit out of time, but I would suggest that we'll take a couple of questions from the Q&A and then we'll start to wrap up. So as we were talking about 3D printing, so here's a question about how to tax 3D printed products. Do you have already a ready-made answer to this, or it's still, something to be dealt with?
So we've actually had some conversations with people about this, and it's very challenging. If you buy a product that's been manufactured by someone else at a retail or online, then you're taxed on the value of the finished product. But if you're doing something like home production, if I'm manufacturing something myself, I've downloaded a particular file from the internet or from one of the platforms that's associated with many of the 3D printing systems, and I print something myself, then arguably the only thing that I can be taxed on is the filament. For example, if it's a plastic printed piece with a filament, I can't be taxed on the value of the product itself. I can only be taxed on the value of the materials that went into it. So there are certainly questions around what you tax. Do you tax the value of the digital file that was used to produce the product as opposed to the value of the product itself? Do you put a tax on the amount of time that the 3D printer is used? So yes, it's an open question, and clearly, finance and revenue agencies are looking for ways to continue to shift revenue sources to emerging areas in the new economy and away from ones that are declining in the old economy.
Yeah, that's a joint challenge for all the countries and for the international players, definitely too. So there's a comment or question about the COVID-19 crisis evoking conservatism, and is there a chance that it might prohibit the transition to the next digital economy? Any comments on that from your side?
So I won't comment on politics. As a public servant, I'm going to stay away from that one. But I would say that the digital technologies that we're talking about and the changes that we are talking about are in many respects agnostic. They don't care about politics, and they don't care about those things. The only way that I could see it being impeded is if there is, I said potentially, we talked about the potential for different trading blocks, digital trading blocks, for example, the Android versus iOS system. We already see China has a very well-developed domestic system. There's a lot of talk about the Great Firewall of China. So there are some indications that you could see that if there's a continued tension between the US and China on the trade side, we could see that system continue to evolve along those lines with different systems, which could impede a global shift towards this digital economy. But at the same time, it could be potentially advanced within regional trading blocks or regional digital trading blocks. So I personally, I don't think that the stripe of your politics has that much impact on the digital technologies. As I said, they're agnostic because they're not based on humans. They're digital.
And I say that my most favorable question for the last, this being that how has the Canadian government reacted to the results of your work on next digital economy, and what's the top 3 things that they will do now? And the same is actually, I would like to turn to Taavi afterwards too, and what should the Estonian government do now? The first top 3 things to be tackled in the light of transition to the next digital economy. But Marcus and Kristel, the floor is yours.
Okay. So what governments exactly do with our work is kind of usually part of kind of some of those processes that would fall out of public domain, but we can talk a bit about so one of the things that happened is that, of course, we present this work to, and we have conversations with our deputy ministers steering committee, which are the deputy ministers from a broad set of the different silo departments, to say so. So one of the things that the next digital economy really brought to them, what they really valued, is to understand kind of how the implications on one area impacts the other one. So it helps them to start thinking in a more holistic way. So every single one of deputy ministers in some kind of a way has been thinking about technology hitting kind of their department or their domain, policy domain. What this type of work actually does is kind of to show, that slide with the 10 implication areas that Marcus went through, from economic development to taxation to social policy to environmental policy, etc. It kind of shows kind of the broad ramifications that you can have and that you have to work together actually. Because if you do change in one area, it has impacts on others. You can't just deal with one aspect and not deal with the whole if you want to succeed. So there was actually kind of a quite important moment, I would say, I would argue, is kind of having that big overview. They really valued that, of like what the realm was of the difficulties that they were challenged with. On the other side, what we also did is we have been taking this presentation and these conversations to a number of departments. I can't even like sum them. I mean, a number of conversations we had with decision makers to really think about what does it mean for your department? What does it really make for your decision making? For example, the tax agency, the Canadian Revenue Agency, it's called here. We have discussions with them like, okay, so the consequences on tax, what does it mean? And how do you change your strategy? And help them really think through. Again, we're not the decision makers as a Foresight Center. I suppose it's the same on your side. We are there to help policymakers make better decisions. So we have been taking these conversations in a lot of places for them to be able to make the changes, which again, we can't always comment on. One specific example that I gave in the beginning was that it was, and there is some public information about it, that it was used to stress test some of the economic and social policy areas as part of what is known in Canada as medium-term planning, the transition planning as new governments were coming into place. So so they took kind of the scenarios, and we made some special, special cuts of it for them, mainly on the future of work. And they went to look like, okay, so if these are the kind of the scenarios we might be hit with, are we ready? Will the programs we have hit their target of what they're intended to do, or are we missing? Do we need to redesign them? And are there other things that just we don't have policy tools for? And so they have really done that very detailed work. And again, kind of the conclusions are part of kind of more less public available data. But this is kind of the way it creates awareness, I would say. It influences certain very specific decisions, and it kind of builds also that muscle of people kind of constantly thinking about, taking that alternative scenario. What would we do? It's kind of a muscle building for the organization. It's called the Government of Canada. So it has, yes, it has served. We're very confident. We have seen things change. We see that people are thinking differently. We see decisions being taken differently. And we're very proud of that, actually, because as you all know, as a government agency, doing foresight in any type of organization it's hard to measure impact sometimes. We get these questions on impact quite often for good reasons. I think we can say that on this one we had quite a lot of impact internally.
Yeah, well, I mean, great language, developing the muscle for systematic thinking about future. Taavi, could I turn to you? In light of today's discussion, what would be some top 3 things that the Estonian government should think about?
Well, I think because of the COVID crisis, the trend that is happening very fast, and that we have noticed that the trend already 5, 6, perhaps even 7 years ago, is the countries competing with each other for who gives better services, and the location or distance are becoming less relevant. So we should focus more on that, definitely. Secondly, if we talk about how to be ready for next potential outburst, be it COVID, be it any other non-conventional crisis, there I would say that we should definitely use the current data, analyze it as well as we possibly can. And I think we are all, most nations in the world are ready for military crisis. All the armies train all the time. Even if the probability of a war in those particular regions is, let's say, 1%, they exercise all the time. They know what will happen at one scenario. They know what happens at another scenario. It's not always so good with different crises, and we sure know that the world wasn't actually ready for a virus outburst. So the best thing we can do is to learn from that. And I think if I can only focus on one thing, then using big data to model all sorts of scenarios of both the virus outburst and also all sorts of restrictions, so that we actually know what causes what, and we can rely on facts rather than our scientific approach rather than our feelings. And last point is that we clearly see some of the sectors in the world that have won from this contactless world. One of them is video conferencing. Zoom is a great example, growing much in value and capacity, but there are, of course, others. It's perfectly normal now to have work meetings directly from your home, and this creates additional opportunities for lots of businesses. And from government perspective, we have to look at sectors that we need to enable with regulation. If we can just come up with 1 or 2, then I would mention all sorts of autonomous driving, be it delivery robots, be it transport for passengers without the taxi driver in the taxi. And secondly, of course, also new business models, because I don't know how much it changes, but it definitely changes some of the way we work, some of the way we go or don't go to offices. And what I have seen already during this less than 2 months of lockdown, that did actually more to Estonian regional policy than most of the governments combined. Because when you can actually have all the meetings from your living room or bedroom in some cases, or bathroom, I don't know who was where, it doesn't matter whether you are in the capital city or you are in the countryside or on a remote island. And people actually love, at least in Estonia, we keep our normal social distancing is 5 meters, not 2. So it was actually uncomfortable for us to keep this 2 meters. So we like to be in the nature, and that actually helped us to do that. So probably it will change. I don't know how much, but government's role is to at least to try to predict what will happen in people's minds, and help them to achieve what they want to achieve. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for this excellent discussion. I reluctantly have to wrap up now because we have exceeded our time limits already. I hope it did not mess up your plans for later, but it was just such a pity to disrupt this discussion. Anyway, there was lots of food for thought for me, and I hope that all of our listeners got something that provoked their ideas, broadened their understanding of what may lie ahead in terms of the ongoing digital transition. The recording of today will be made available on our webpage. You are welcome to spread the word and to share the recording, and of course to listen it again yourself too. And this was the last webinar by Foresight Center this spring, but we'll carry on with webinars in the autumn, and I'd be glad to see you online again, and you are welcome to also share the information with your colleagues and friends. And thank you very much for speaking in today's event, for sharing your ideas and knowledge. And thank you for all the listeners. Have a good evening in the Estonian case, and have a good day for our Canadian guests. See you around. Thank you.
Thank you.